The Artemis Expedition drifted silently through the endless void of space, its metallic hull glinting against the distant light of an unrecognizable star. Within its confines, 6 individuals prepared themselves for what was promised to be humanity's greatest triumph. Eden VII, a verdant exoplanet orbiting the Kepler 452 system, represented hope for a dying Earth. With oceans shrinking and the air growing thin, this mission was not just an exploration, it was a lifeline. Commander Eli Drake sat in the cockpit, his fingers drumming against the console. The sight before him, Eden VII suspended in the void, should have inspired awe, but his chest felt heavy. It was too perfect. The scans showed a planet with breathable air, clean water, and fertile land. No major threats, no advanced civilizations. He should have felt relief. Instead, there was unease, a weight that pressed harder the closer they got. "We're on final approach," said Lena Cho, the pilot, her voice steady despite the turbulence rocking the ship. She adjusted their trajectory, eyes fixed on the growing sphere of greens and blues. Atmospheric conditions are optimal, should be a smooth descent. Behind her, Marco Alvarez muttered a prayer under his breath, clutching a tiny metal charm. The engineer was a man of logic, but he didn't trust what he couldn't explain. "I still don't get it," he said, louder this time. "A planet this perfect, this untouched. Why isn't anything living here, building, expanding? Feels unnatural." Dr. Naomi Yates, the mission's biologist, glanced up from her terminal. "It's not unnatural, Marco. It's unique, a gift. Not every planet develops intelligent life. Maybe it's our turn to make something out of it. Or maybe it's hiding something," Marco shot back, but Naomi dismissed him with a shrug, returning to her notes. As the ship pierced the outer atmosphere, the cockpit dimmed and emergency lights flickered on. Lena frowned, tapping the console. "Pressure spikes," she said. "Nothing major, but I don't like it. Could just be an instrumentation error." "Could be," Tessa Mori interjected from the rear station, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. The xenogeologist was still young, a rising star in her field. "But the readings are fascinating. Look at this. The atmospheric composition keeps fluctuating like it's alive." Drake raised an eyebrow. "Alive? It's just a figure of speech," she added quickly, realizing how it sounded. "The levels aren't consistent, that's all. Nothing dangerous." The turbulence ceased as they broke through the clouds, and Eden VII unveiled itself in breathtaking clarity. Rolling hills of emerald green stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with alien flora that shimmered under twin suns. Lakes mirrored the sky, their surfaces reflecting hues humans had no names for. "My God," Callum Bryce, the mission's medical officer, breathed. He rarely spoke unless necessary, but now he stood at the viewport, transfixed. "It's beautiful." The beauty, however, was marred by a peculiar stillness. Even as the ship settled onto a flat, rocky plain near a dense forest, no movement stirred the landscape. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through the trees. Only the faint hum of the ship broke the oppressive silence. "Base camp established," Drake said as the ship's thrusters powered down. "All right, everyone. We've got 24 hours to get a preliminary survey before we transmit back to Earth. Let's make it count." As the crew disembarked, the alien soil crunched beneath their boots, fine and powdery like volcanic ash. Marco bent down to scoop a handful, letting it sift through his fingers. "Feels sterile," he noted. "It's not," Naomi corrected, holding up a scanner. "The soil's alive with microorganisms, similar to Earth, but completely alien. We'll need to study them in the lab." Drake led the group toward the forest's edge. The trees, tall and cylindrical, were unlike anything on Earth, with bark that seemed to glisten in the sunlight. Tessa couldn't contain her enthusiasm, darting from specimen to specimen. "It's incredible," she whispered, taking photos and scraping samples. Naomi, however, lingered behind, frowning at the scanner in her hand. "That's odd," she muttered. "What is?" Bryce asked, stepping closer. "The microbial activity in the soil. It's fluctuating, almost like it's reacting to us." Bryce frowned, but said nothing. He trusted Naomi's instincts, but science often revealed strange truths. For now, it was simply another mystery to unravel. As dusk fell, the crew returned to the habitat module and sealed themselves inside. Outside, Eden VII's twin suns dipped below the horizon, bathing the planet in a dim purple glow. Inside, laughter broke the tension as the team shared stories over vacuum-sealed rations. Even Drake allowed himself a small smile. For the first time, the sense of unease lifted. But unnoticed by all, the soil tracked inside on their boots began to stir, its microscopic spores seeking warmth, moisture, and hosts. The habitat module hummed softly, its systems working to maintain a fragile bubble of Earth-like comfort in the alien wilderness. The crew had fallen into a routine: collect samples, document findings, run analyses. The sheer abundance of discovery filled the days with purpose, but under the surface, something unseen was beginning to take root. It started with Marco. "I can't stop scratching," he grumbled over breakfast, pulling at the cuff of his uniform. His forearm was red and raw, the skin marred with fine scratches where his nails had raked. "Feels like a damn bug bite, but I haven't seen anything out there that bites." Dr. Bryce leaned over, inspecting the irritation. "Looks like contact dermatitis," he said. "Could be from the flora, some alien equivalent to poison ivy." He applied a salve from the medical kit and advised Marco to avoid touching the affected area. Marco nodded but didn't look convinced. By the next morning, the irritation had spread. Red, web-like lines coursed up his arm and across his chest, pulsating faintly. Marco's skin was hot to the touch, his face flushed. "This isn't just a rash," Naomi said, scanning him with the med unit. The device beeped erratically, its readout indecipherable. "There's something moving under his skin." "I can feel it," Marco said, his voice shaking. He clenched his fists to keep from scratching, but his nails had already left deep grooves along his arms. "It's like it's crawling through me." Dr. Bryce worked furiously to identify the cause, but the med unit offered no answers. His best guess, some form of microbial infection from the soil. He prescribed rest and hydration, but the unease in his expression betrayed his doubts. The others tried to focus on their work, but Marco's worsening condition loomed over the camp. By midday, he was confined to his bunk, feverish and delirious. He muttered incoherently, clutching at his chest. Naomi stayed by his side, trying to soothe him. Then, in the dead of night, the screaming started. It tore through the habitat like a knife, jarring everyone from sleep. Marco thrashed wildly in his bunk, his limbs convulsing as his back arched unnaturally. His shirt had torn open, revealing swollen, pulsating nodules along his torso. They glowed faintly, an eerie bioluminescent green that pulsed in time with his ragged breathing. "Hold him down," Drake shouted, rushing to Marco's side. Naomi and Bryce struggled to restrain him, but Marco's strength was impossible. His muscles, swollen and corded, strained against their grip. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his mouth opened in a soundless scream as one of the nodules burst. A spray of viscous, greenish fluid hit the wall, and something small and writhing dropped onto the floor. "What the hell is that?" Lena gasped, backing away. The creature was no larger than a finger, its translucent body wriggling on the floor. It pulsed rhythmically, its segmented form glistening under the habitat's harsh lights. Naomi grabbed a containment jar, scooping it up and sealing it inside. Marco's body went limp, his breathing shallow. His skin had turned an unnatural, sickly gray, the glowing nodules still pulsating across his chest and arms. "We need to do something," Naomi said, her voice trembling. Dr. Bryce shook his head, helpless. "We don't even know what this is." Before they could decide, Marco's body convulsed violently, throwing Naomi to the ground. His head snapped toward her, his eyes no longer human but pitch black, reflecting the light like polished onyx. "It's inside me," Marco croaked, his voice guttural and distorted. His body contorted in unnatural ways, joints bending where they shouldn't. He let out a guttural scream before lunging at Naomi, his hands clawing at her throat. Drake and Lena wrestled him away, pinning him against the wall. Marco snarled, his strength inhuman, but Lena grabbed the nearest blunt object, a metal supply rod, and struck him across the temple. He crumpled to the floor, unmoving. The silence that followed was suffocating. Bryce knelt by Marco's body, his hands shaking. "He's gone," he said finally, his voice hollow. But no one moved. The nodules on Marco's body still pulsed faintly, and Naomi swore she saw his fingers twitch. "We can't leave him like this," Drake said, his jaw tight. He grabbed a fuel canister and a lighter. "Are you sure?" Lena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Drake didn't answer. The flames consumed Marco's body quickly, the acrid smoke filling the habitat. But even as his flesh burned away, the nodules writhed, popping like overripe fruit, releasing faint bursts of glowing spores into the air. The crew stood in stunned silence, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. "Is it over?" Tessa asked, her voice shaking. Naomi looked down at the containment jar in her hand, the writhing creature still alive inside. "No," she said quietly. "It's not over." As the others stared at the jar in horror, they failed to notice the faint, glowing trails left on their boots and uniforms. The spores had already begun to spread. The flames had barely faded from Marco's pyre when the tension inside the habitat reached a breaking point. No one spoke, their breaths shallow and measured, as though words might stir the spores lingering in the air. They had burned Marco, but his presence lingered, a gnawing reminder of how quickly one of them could become something else. Drake was the first to break the silence. "We need to decontaminate the habitat," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Burn our suits, scrub every surface." "And then what?" Lena snapped, her voice sharp with panic. She was clutching her injured shoulder where Marco had bitten her during his final, desperate lunge. Blood had seeped through the bandage, darkening the fabric. "This place is a death trap. We need to get off this planet now." "Not without answers," Naomi cut in. She held the containment jar, the creature within wriggling against the glass like a malevolent heartbeat. Her eyes were hollow with exhaustion, but her grip on the jar was firm. "We don't know if we're carrying it with us. If we leave without understanding what this is, we could take it back to Earth. And if we stay, it kills us all," Lena shot back. Drake raised a hand, silencing both of them. "Enough. We focus on survival first. No one's leaving until we know who's infected and how to stop it. Tessa, Bryce, run every test you can think of on that thing." He gestured to the jar. "And on the rest of us. We need answers now." Tessa nodded, though her hands trembled as she carried the jar to the lab station. The creature inside seemed to react to her proximity, its pulsations quickening. The hours dragged on as the crew worked in strained silence. Drake scrubbed every surface of the habitat with disinfectant, his jaw set in grim determination. Naomi sifted through environmental samples, her hands trembling as she examined soil and spores under the microscope. Bryce monitored everyone's vitals, though his equipment provided only the barest insight, and Lena paced like a caged animal, her eyes darting toward the lab every time she passed it. Tessa's voice finally broke the silence. "I think it's a hive mind." The others turned to her. She was pale, her skin slick with sweat, but her voice was steady. "The spores, the larvae, whatever they are, they're not acting independently. They're communicating, coordinating. Every host they infect isn't just a victim, it becomes part of the larger organism. The more it spreads, the smarter it gets." Naomi stared at the writhing creature in the jar, horror dawning on her face. That's why Marco changed. It wasn't just an infection, it was assimilation. "So, what does that mean for us?" Drake asked, his tone calm but edged with fear. Tessa hesitated, her eyes flickering to Lena. "It means that if any of us are infected, we're already part of it. And if we leave this planet..." Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. "I told you," Lena shouted, slamming her fist on the table. "We have to leave now, before this thing turns us into monsters like it did to Marco." Drake's eyes narrowed. "We don't even know if you're infected." The room went still. Lena froze, her breathing shallow as the others stared at her. "You think it's me?" she said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "You saw him bite me. I didn't ask for this." "We're not accusing anyone," Bryce said quickly, stepping between her and Drake. "But we need to be careful. Isolation might be the best." "Like hell you're locking me up," Lena shouted, backing toward the door. Drake moved to block her, but she was faster. She grabbed a utility knife from the counter and pointed it at him, her hand trembling. "Stay away from me. I'm not like him. I can feel it." "Lena, "Put the knife down," Naomi said softly, edging closer. But before anyone could act, Lena's body convulsed. She dropped the knife, clutching her injured shoulder as veins darkened and spread across her skin. Her screams filled the room, the sound raw and primal. "Get back!" Bryce shouted, dragging Naomi and Tessa away. Lena collapsed to the floor, her body writhing in agony. Her limbs twisted unnaturally, her jaw snapping open with a sickening crack. Her eyes, wide with terror, met Drake's for a fleeting moment before black veins consumed them entirely. "Lena," Drake whispered, his voice breaking. The transformation was swift. Her muscles swelled, tearing through the fabric of her uniform, and her skin hardened into a glossy, chitinous surface. She rose from the floor with inhuman grace, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her mouth opened, emitting a guttural, otherworldly shriek that reverberated through the habitat. Drake didn't hesitate. He grabbed the flamethrower from the supply rack and pulled the trigger. The burst of fire engulfed Lena, her shrieks turning into ear-piercing wails. She staggered, clawing at the air, before collapsing into a smoldering heap. The silence that followed was suffocating. Drake lowered the flamethrower, his hands shaking. "No one else leaves the habitat," he said, his voice hard. "We end this here." But as the others looked at the blackened remains on the floor, a deeper fear settled over them. The spores weren't just outside. They were in the air, the water, the soil. No one could be sure if they were already infected, and no one dared to ask. In the corner of the room, the containment jar sat on the counter. The creature inside had stopped writhing and lay motionless, but faint tendrils of bioluminescent green spread across the glass, pulsating like a heartbeat. The habitat was silent now, save for the faint hum of failing machinery. The air felt heavier, as if the spores had thickened it, sinking into every pore, every breath. Commander Drake sat at the center table, his head in his hands. His shoulders, usually squared with resolve, sagged under the crushing weight of what remained. Only three of them were left. Naomi Yates leaned against the lab counter, staring blankly at the containment jar. The creature inside had grown since Lena's death, its translucent body now opaque and veined with pulsing green light. It no longer writhed, but expanded and contracted in steady, rhythmic pulses, like lungs drawing breath. In the corner, Callum Bryce sat with his back against the wall, his medkit discarded beside him. He was no longer the calm, collected doctor. His eyes, bloodshot and sunken, darted toward every sound, every shadow. His hands trembled as they rested on the scalpel he clutched like a talisman. "It's too late," Bryce muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. "We're infected, all of us. It's only a matter of time." Naomi shook her head. "We don't know that," she said, though her voice cracked. She didn't believe her own words. Drake raised his head, his eyes bloodshot but hard. "We can't give up. We finish what we came here to do. If we can stop this, even if it costs us—" "It's already cost us," Bryce snapped, his voice rising. He gestured wildly at the room, at the charred remains of Lena in the corner. "Marco, Lena, Tessa. They're gone and we're next. Do you think Earth will listen to a warning? They'll come anyway, and this thing will take them just like it's taking us." Drake slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the small space. "Then we make sure they don't come, no matter what." Naomi stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "We still have the ship. If we can isolate the infection, maybe we can—" The lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the containment jar was empty. Naomi's heart stopped. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A low, wet scraping sound came from the shadows near the airlock. Drake grabbed the flamethrower and took a cautious step forward. Naomi clutched a metal rod, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Bryce stayed frozen, his eyes locked on the darkness. Then it emerged. It had grown exponentially, its body towering and hunched, a grotesque amalgamation of muscle, chitin, and what remained of Marco's and Lena's twisted features. Their faces were melded into its torso, their mouths opening and closing in soundless agony. The creature moved with unnatural grace, its limbs elongated and jointed in ways that defied biology. It pulsed with that same sickening bioluminescence, veins glowing faintly beneath its glistening surface. Drake didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, sending a stream of fire toward the monstrosity. The flames engulfed it, but the creature didn't scream. Instead, it lunged forward, its flesh bubbling but undeterred. "Run!" Drake shouted, holding his ground as the creature bore down on him. Naomi grabbed Bryce by the arm, dragging him toward the ship's hatch. The two stumbled through the narrow corridor, the sound of Drake's shouts and the creature's inhuman growls growing fainter behind them. As they reached the Artemis, Bryce collapsed, clutching his chest. "I can't," he gasped, his face contorting in pain. Naomi knelt beside him, her hands trembling. She tore open his uniform, revealing dark, pulsating veins spreading across his chest. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Bryce looked up at her, his eyes wide with terror. "It's inside me," he choked out. "You have to end it." She shook her head, backing away. "I can't." "You have to," he said, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. His grip was cold, his veins blackened and swollen. "Before it takes me, before it takes you." The sound of heavy, wet footsteps echoed down the corridor. The creature was coming. Naomi stood, her resolve hardening. She grabbed the flamethrower strapped to the wall and pointed it at Bryce. His eyes met hers, a silent plea for mercy. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The flames consumed him quickly, his screams echoing through the ship. But there was no time to grieve. The creature was here. It lunged at her, its movements impossibly fast. Naomi fired, but the flames barely slowed it. She retreated toward the cockpit, sealing the bulkhead doors behind her. Her breathing was ragged, her hands slick with sweat as she activated the ship's engines. Through the viewport, she saw the habitat collapsing under the weight of the infection. The forest surrounding it was no longer still. The alien trees writhed as though alive, their movements synchronized with the pulsations of the creature. Naomi knew she couldn't let it leave this planet. Her hands flew across the console, setting the ship's self-destruct sequence. The countdown began, a cold, mechanical voice echoing in the empty cockpit. She transmitted a final message to Earth, her voice shaking but resolute. "This is Dr. Naomi Yates of the Artemis Expedition. Eden VII is a death trap. Do not send another crew. Destroy any signals from this planet. If you're hearing this, it's already too late." The bulkhead behind her buckled, and the creature tore through, its many faces locked in expressions of rage and agony. Naomi turned to face it, her eyes burning with defiance. The last thing she saw was its pulsating, glistening mass surging toward her. The ship erupted in a blinding flash of light, consuming the creature, the habitat, and everything around it in a fiery explosion. Months later, Earth received the transmission. It was fragmented and distorted, Naomi's voice barely audible beneath layers of static. But one phrase cut through clearly, repeated over and over in a hollow, distorted tone. "They don't just kill you, they become you." The signal ended, and then silence.